but back up in that valley, it's utterly gorgeous, and you can hike. People hike the Laguna Trail for days at a time. You can go from cabin to cabin, just taking this long walk. Something to really plan for. But you do have to have the right vehicle going in there. There's about 8 rivers you have to cross. And if you ever want to do this on your own, you really have to know your vehicle and know how to cross rivers. A lot of people get into trouble because they don't know the depth of a river or the wading depth of a vehicle. That's how it's all determined. Every vehicle has what's called a wading depth. It could be like 70 centimeters. It's how far the vehicle could go into the water before the engine might be impacted. And then with the rivers, they change height all the time depending on the rain, the conditions. So you have to really know what you're doing to do that. But absolutely beautiful to get back in there. And that area was famous. It was one of the locations here for Game of Thrones. So it's very, very beautiful. You can look it up. It's Thorsmork. And these other waterfalls, equally spectacular. I mean, a lot of these are, you have to get there by hiking, or, in this case, this one is on private land. So, a lot of Iceland is private land, and there's a rule in the Nordic countries that you can. It's called basically the rule of roaming, where you can walk over anyone's land and even camp there, as long as you don't do any damage. The only exception to that is, the areas that are marked off for sheep or, cattle grazing. So, for instance, in this sheep pen. But generally, you're allowed to move around. Those laws have been amended here in Iceland recently because of the massive tourism. Iceland now has about 2.5 million visitors a year for a population of less than 400,000. And it's a victim of its own success. It actually went on a tourist binge after the 2008 financial collapse. So maybe some of you know this, but Iceland played a big role in that. They had unregulated banking system, and there were several large Ponzi schemes created here in Iceland, the most notorious of which was called Icesave, and most of the UK pension fund was invested in Icesave, and it turned out to be a shell game and collapsed entirely. Iceland is the only place where bankers actually went to jail, and Iceland revised its banking system and its laws, and it's not perfect, but it did a lot to recover from that. And part of it was growing its tourism industry, which is now a very significant part of the economy. If you look on the mountains on the left, those mountains used to be the old shoreline of Iceland. And over time, with the movement, the geologic movement, they were pushed upwards. And all of this that you see here to the right, off into the distance, this is all newer land being formed from the eruptions and the wash out into the sea. And you can see the eruption lines in the old cliffs here. All of those strata lines, those are various eruptions over periods of time. And you're looking back over millions of years of history there. Because between each eruption could be a few hundred, or in some cases, thousands, tens of thousands of years. On our left here, you have most definitely a elf chapel currently inhabited by sheep. if you look at about far right, about 4 o'clock, you'll see some mountains over there. That's actually the island Vestmannaeyr, which is well known. About 50 years ago, the volcano that is Vestmannaeyr, it's a little volcanic island, it erupted, and the town fought off the lava. It ate about a third of the houses, but before they were able to stop it with fire hoses. And so it's an incredible place to visit. Since then it's rebounded and thrives. And if you were here a couple weeks ago, you'd be able to see a very interesting tradition with the puffins. The pufflings all hatch in the spring and spend the summer in the nests getting fat. And around late August, they take their first journey into the ocean. They dive off the cliffs straight into the ocean, and they stay there for 1 to 2 years. They don't come back to land. And on the Vestmannaeyr, where there's a lot of puffin colonies, the puffins can get confused at night when they're supposed to jump into the ocean. They see the lights of the city and they think it's a full moon, and they jump towards the city. So the children of Vestmannaeyr go around and collect these pufflings that are out on the streets, and they bring them to the cliffs in the morning and they throw them into the ocean. Vestmannaeyr is also famous for, if you know the film Free Willy, the orca famously described in that movie. He was set free here in the Vestmannaeyr. In the island itself, there's a little bay, and that's where the orca was rehabilitated before being released back out at sea. And it survived about 2 years before it swam to Norway, lived for a year, and then ended up finally dying. But at least it had 2 years of freedom. It's interesting to compare the way in which Icelandic films see, film directors and writers see the landscape here versus the way in which people from the outside see it. I mean, it is absolutely gorgeous and cinematic and beautiful, but in Iceland, people living here for 1,000 years under very harsh conditions, they tend to look at this landscape differently. They see it as a very, very difficult place to live, and you see that reflected in the cinema. So, whereas Western or Hollywood or European cinema tends to glorify the landscape, so you have everything from The Secret Life of Walter Mitty to Tom Cruise movies to Game of Thrones shot here. Icelandic cinema, it's almost always portrayed as a very challenging, even ominous place. So recently the films like Godland, which was nominated for an Oscar, I think it might have won the Oscar, about a parishioner trying to set up a church here 150 years ago. And Rams is another great movie from about 6-7 years ago about the difficulty of two brothers living on a farm. So if you have a chance, you should take a look at that. And also that's reflected a bit in the literature. A lot of very, very good writers here in Iceland. Iceland is actually the largest per capita number of book buyers in the world. So for a small country, they buy more books per capita than anywhere else. They read a lot, on average maybe an hour a day. They publish a lot. So about 1 in 10 Icelanders will publish a book in their lifetime. The best gift at Christmas is a book. If you have an Icelander that you want to make happy, just get them a book at Christmas. And there's a really interesting little bookstore way up in the north, in the West Fjords, in a little fjord called Flati. And that is such a remote place that in the 1800s, only one family lived there for 60 years in this tiny little fjord. Now it has maybe 100 people living in this tiny town, but in the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, a bookstore opened there, and that's the oldest surviving bookstore, continuous running bookstore in Iceland, in this tiny little town. So that tells you a lot about people's love of literature. The one writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, Halldór Laxness, he's quite famous, and you can pick up his books either at the airport or a bookstore in Reykjavik. He won the Oscar for a book called the Nobel Prize for a book called Independent People, and he has another great book called Under the Glacier. And there's another writer, famous now, contemporary writer. Halldór Laxness was writing 70 years ago. His name is Andres Snare Magnusson, and he wrote a book recently called On Time and Water, a reflection on the environmental issues that Iceland and the world are facing. And he famously, about 6 years ago, made a bronze plaque that was put on top of Oak Mountain, formerly Oak Glacier, which was the first glacier to be declared extinct, dead here in Iceland. And his plaque is a warning to the future. It's set at 415 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. And he warns that we know exactly what to do to solve this problem, but only people in the future reading this will know if we were successful. Right now, we're at 427 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, so we're not on a successful path. But he's a very good writer, and one of his books is being turned into an HBO film, so you might see that as well. And what he's most concerned about right now, of course, is the climate change and the shrinking of the glaciers. The glaciers here, the ones we're going to be passing in the south, they're receding some at the rate of 100 meters a year, which is very fast. So if you have a chance, you should, if you come back this way, there's a beautiful glacier you can walk on, which is called Solheimiljökull. It's very close to the road. These are glaciers that are coming down off of the very large Mjavnesjökull, which is the one that sits on top of Katla, this volcano. Oh, by the way, so if you look at this little turf house here on the left, those are the way, that's actually for farm animals, but that's the way Viking houses were constructed. They were basically sod houses, which is why you don't see many today, because they've all disappeared. You can see a little example of that way off of the hillside right there, and that's again used for farm animals and that sort of thing, but it's the same construction that the Vikings used, which is why you see so many modern houses in Iceland, because there's really not a lot left over from that time. Most, again, what was left over were the words, the ideas, the stories, the mythologies. And, people like Andres Sneer Magnusson carry that tradition in their writing. Iceland is really a nation built on storytelling, and that's very much part of the Norse tradition, the Viking tradition, gathering around the hearth at night and telling stories. And it was also part of the Celtic tradition, the Irish tradition, and the mingling of the two lent itself to this very long history of storytelling. And that history really, in the modern times, stretches back all the way to the 1200s. And that's when the sagas were first written down on calfskin. And so the reason we know about the Vikings is because of a man named Snorri Sturluson, who lived a little northeast of Reykjavik. He was one of the famous chieftains and an incredible writer. And I'll tell you a bit more about him in a second, but to the left of us is Skogafoss. That's a very dramatic and powerful waterfall that's well worth a visit if you have a chance in the future. All these waterfalls are about 200 feet, 120 meters. That's the level here of the mountains you see. Nothing here in Iceland is that high. The highest point is about 2,000 meters. But back to Snorri Sturluson. So he wrote down the sagas and the Eddas, and that's why we know these stories today. And he was called the Homer of the North, because he wrote in a very prose style describing the daily life of people here, as well as, the heroic deeds of gods and men and chieftains, but also just life itself. Which gives a beautiful portrait of how people lived. And we almost lost his works to history in a giant fire that happened in Copenhagen in the 1700s, but thankfully, as the fire consumed about half the town, his works which had been moved to Copenhagen, are successfully saved. And they're now back in the museum here in Reykjavik, so you can see those if you're interested in the National Museum. And if you look to the left, you can see Sørhimmeljökull, which is the glacier coming down from Mjødresjökull, sitting on top of Katla. You can also do a hike onto that glacier if you want. There's a company that runs hiking tours right there. Yeah, that's a very good view of the glacier from here. So Katla, which sits just under those clouds there, Katla goes off about every 80 years, and it's about 20 years overdue. Last year they thought it might be in the process of an eruption because there was a giant glacial outburst where the waters came down and washed out the road that we're on just past Vik. It was washed out for about 5 days, but it turned out that it wasn't an eruption, it was just the movement of magma. And who knows when it'll happen. Vik itself, the town we're going through, has an evacuation plan because it's very possible that the eruption could send water cascading down and wiping out the town of Vik. No one knows. It's happened before in other areas where, not directly into Vik, but you don't know the path that it's going to take.
El año pasado, lo que habíamos pasado ya, pero este año es un movimiento de más. Esta canción te gusta. Oh.
coming. Sound not coming. We are speaking. We are speaking, but no one knows that. They stop it.
In the distance, ahead of us, a bit on the right, you can see some of the very dramatic rock formations that are along the coast here. These are part of the lava outpouring that then erodes over centuries and millennium. Basically, probably since the last glacial period when a lot of erosion happened. And so you have these just very dramatic basalt outcroppings that in Icelandic folklore are considered a lot of times to be anthropomorphic, like trolls, for instance, that have been frozen by the sunlight and stuck as rocks for the eternity. You'll see a lot more of those up north as well.